Imagine for a moment that somebody in casual conversation referenced what's happening at the US-Mexico border. Imagine they called the detention centers concentration camps, okay? Maybe you've heard this, maybe you haven't. If you have, maybe you've thought about it for a while and your opinion's formed. But if you just heard it, maybe the first thought that came through your mind was, is this a false equivalency? I feel like that's a little extreme. In fact, that is an argument, and I've actually, people close to me, I've heard them say that it's actually probably insensitive to survivors of the Holocaust to refer to the detainment centers at the US-Mexico border as concentration camps. Well, I think that intuitively carries some weight. You definitely don't want to diminish the atrocities of the Holocaust. But this whole line of thought raises a really important question. Why, when people think of mass systematic dehumanization and murder, do people's minds automatically and only go to the Holocaust? Well, there's a few main reasons. First, because it was the most extreme and systematic form of mass dehumanization, torture, and murder. But if you want to say never again, and have that mean anything substantial beyond just lofty feelings, then we have to seriously consider what leads to mass murder. In the United States, it seems most people are a lot less educated in other forms of mass dehumanization and systemic murder, much less other instances of real fascism. People don't even know who Mussolini or Franco Francisco were. They just know Hitler. It seems that people remember how France rolled over for the Nazis, but never learned that the US has its own history of anti-Semitism that included turning away thousands of Jewish asylum seekers fleeing the Nazis. Of course, we think of how Jewish people are treated when we think of dehumanization, but German, Italian, and Spanish fascists considered socialists, anarchists, and communists to be part of the world Jewry conspiracy, and anyone perceived as red was also systematically tortured and murdered.
In 1944, as a prisoner in the Nazi death camp at Dachau, he wrote the following. In Germany, they came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade.
However, this fixation on extremes in other countries seems to distract from the US genocide of its own indigenous populations, the mass internment of Japanese in concentration camps, or the incessant support the US has given to fascist dictators across the globe, lending them support to round up and kill their own indigenous populations, socialists, black, and LGBTQ plus communities. If you're watching the screen right now, then you see that the list goes on and on. But for now, I'll leave off on this note by just saying that the links are in the description. So obviously, there's not a lot of education around this, but the more I've looked into it, the more that I see the lessons of the 20th century are something that I need to be learning the most that I can possibly learn about. And, we can't say that we want, to fight for a better world or keep things the same way if we aren't seriously engaging history in the 20th century and thinking about what happened, what led to so much genocide on the level that it was committed by so many countries in the 20th century was not possible at that scale without the invention of the concentration camp. Death camps are not usually built under the name of oh, this is going to be a death camp, right? People in Nazi Germany were not oh, my neighbors are being taken away to the death camp. No, it was oh, they're being separated because they're going to go back home or wherever they belong. And maybe there were people who were hey, they were born here, right? But then there were other people who were yeah, but their ethnic origin is from some other nation and they need to. And very few people were thinking, oh, there's going to be gas chambers there, right? The mass murder element comes from a nation state being under extreme pressure and scapegoating all of its tensions and stressors onto another and saying, it's them, it's them, it's them. Speaking of learning lessons from the 20th century, some of the thinkers who've thought the most about this include Hannah Arendt, Emmanuel Levinas, Giorgio Agamben, and others. And the thing is they're all in some way responding to or in dialogue with this text, which was written by the Nazi Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt, in this work, proposes that the essence of politics is the friend-enemy distinction. That people make it out to be about freedom, and people make it out to be about equality, and people make it out to be about, all of these different things, when at the end of the day, it's about survival for the in-group, and that survival for the in-group means seeing everybody else as enemies or potential enemies. And that's a scary critique, because it's very easy for a very, very simple-minded person to embrace. And at the same time, it's very easy for someone who spent their entire life studying political philosophy, like Carl Schmitt, to buy into this idea that the integrity and survivability of a nation state relies on reinforcing this friend-enemy distinction in an ideological way, and that all sorts of atrocities are justified because this is the essence of politics. So the thinkers that I like to read are kind of reeling in the aftermath of World War II, trying to think through, well, what produces genocide? What causes genocide?
The correct question to pose concerning the horrors committed in the camps is, therefore, not the hypocritical one of how crimes of such atrocity could be committed against human beings. It would be more honest and, above all, more useful to investigate carefully the juridical procedures and deployments of power by which human beings could be so completely deprived of their rights and prerogatives that no act committed against them could appear any longer as a crime.
The essence of genocide is when boundary policing and boundary enforcement of us versus others is policed to such an extreme, and that the demonization of others is enforced to such an extreme that the justification of, oh, well, we need to send these people away and we need to take away their freedoms and strip away their dignity and treat them like animals, like, well, that just all becomes justified. That is the essence of what leads to genocide, is this stripping of the other of their humanity, reducing them to an animal state. This is what Giorgio Agamben calls bare life. They are reduced to bare life. Okay, before shifting to the next part here, I just want to say, like, bare life is such an important concept, and it's one that people don't seem to understand, that distinction there. Okay, but bare life is when a person has been stripped of legal protections and of basic humanity, insofar as they are not recognized as legitimate subjects of justice by a nation state. It's a category upon which almost every atrocity can be justified. And so, I appreciate that people push back because they think that, we got to be sensitive of survivors of the Holocaust, but Emanuel Levinas and Hannah Arendt, as two of the people who I just referenced, were survivors, and they were Jewish, and they spent their whole lives thinking, what are the systematic conditions that produce death camps, and where is that gray area? Where do we draw the line on that slippery slope where we go from concentration camps into death camps? And a big part of it is this demonization and this, it's just the law, it's just the way the law is, and that kind of thinking gets us into terrible situations that we have to be cognizant of. And as Bo from the Fifth Column, by the way, if you haven't watched Bo's series on concentration camps, you need to. One of the points that Bo brings up, people fleeing horrible conditions to come to the United States, what are they fleeing? They're fleeing a situation created by the United States.
The U.S. backed a coup and triggered a civil war. The gang was founded in the United States. It grew in power because of the United States' move to push a bunch of them to a country with no police. And we trained the leadership that took it from a minor street gang in California and turned it into a transnational criminal enterprise. Tell me again why this is the reason we need a wall?
First, the drug war criminalized entire ways of being. And then it created a black market for drugs. And then the black market for drugs produced some of the most vicious crime lords that this country's ever had to deal with. And then, instead of dealing with the problem we created here because of those policies, Nixon's drug war that was amped up by Reagan was then, addressed by Bill Clinton by taking the most dangerous criminals in the drug war that were being rounded up in places like LA and sending them to Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, where it's exactly where they're fleeing now. People are having their lives ruined because of decisions made in the United States. And then we're like, oh, well, we don't want them here. Well, we shouldn't be creating these situations that people have to flee. We have to think about the causes of the things that lead to the things that we don't like. And if we don't address those causes, then the things are going to keep happening that we don't like. So if we want to address death camps, and if we want to respect those who were reduced to, who were stripped of their humanity and of their dignity and put to death in mass troves by all sorts of groups, not just Nazis, during the 20th century, if we want to do that, then we have to think a lot more seriously about how this otherization, how this demonization, how this us-theming creates this situation. And that's a big part of the research that I'm really interested in. So this gets really close to home to a lot of the stuff that I've been studying. And yeah, if these are the kind of books that you're interested in, if these are the kind of ideas that you would want to go deeper with and understand, I'm looking to revisit these texts soon in a course that would be specifically designed to think a lot more about what is it to be human. What does it mean to strip someone of their humanity? What is it that gets stripped in that process? And what does that do to the ones who strip the other too? Something terrible happens there that's dehumanizing for everybody all around. And I don't think we want that blood on our hands. And so before you get all up in arms because someone's using the words in a way that you don't like, or because, you know, there might be a false equivalency, first just make sure to check for yourself. Where do you draw the line? Because being a citizen of a sovereign state means that ultimately, if you don't draw that line, someone else will draw that line, and you're not going to like being responsible for where they drew that line, and you'll be ashamed of what you let happen, and history will not forget.
Mike Godwin of Godwin's Law, the guy who created an adage because he didn't like false comparisons to the Holocaust. He says they're concentration camps. Now the argument is, but we're not killing anybody. Well, that's fine. We're not calling them death camps. The concentration camp network was built first. The death camps were added later. Yes, they are concentration camps. But I do agree we need to find some way to differentiate between the German ones and our own. I think that's important. So rather than simply calling them concentration camps, we need to call them Trump concentration camps, or the Trump network of concentration camps. In 20 years, when those plaques go up, like those that are at the former Japanese internment camps, that's what they need to say. He wanted a monument to himself. He wanted a legacy. That's why he wanted that stupid wall. He can have his name on these. They're more fitting of his legacy.
Like, follow, subscribe.